Imagine being born into a world where every man around you carried the same blood, where uncles, fathers, and brothers lived under one roof, bound together not only by land but by silence. This was no ordinary household. It was a closed circle of men who refused to let outsiders cross their threshold. Within those walls, loyalty was demanded, secrecy enforced, and lineage folded back upon itself, until no distinction remained between fatherhood and brotherhood. A boy entered this world without celebration, his first breath already marked by the choices of men who came before him. He was not raised with freedom, nor allowed the innocence of ignorance. His very existence stood as a living reflection of a pact that stretched across generations, a pact of bloodlines turned inward. To the neighbors, he became a figure of unease, too familiar in his features, too strange in his presence. Was he destined to become a villain shaped by corruption, or merely a son shackled by the silence of his fathers? Tonight, we open the door to his hidden birth. Before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who seeks the darker truths men left behind. Your support helps keep these hidden histories alive. The valley lay silent beneath towering ridges, a place where men worked the land with weathered hands and lived by rules carved from tradition. Outsiders seldom ventured in, and those who did rarely stayed long. Inside a creaking homestead built from rough timber, a boy entered the world. No celebration marked his first cry. Only fathers, uncles, and brothers gathered, their faces stern, knowing this birth carried shadows heavier than stone. The patriarch, Elias, stood at the foot of the bed, his presence commanding silence. His gaze lingered on the infant, seeing not innocence, but the living echo of choices no man dared speak aloud. Men of the house watched closely, their expressions hardened. They knew this boy was not ordinary. His blood tied him to them in ways that blurred lines of brotherhood and fatherhood, forming bonds both unholy and unbroken. The boy was cradled only by calloused hands of men. Voices deep and rough whispered to him. No lullabies of comfort, only chants, psalms, and half-remembered verses passed between fathers and sons through countless generations. By morning, word had already spread among neighboring men. At the mill, workers muttered over coarse tobacco, glancing toward the ridge where Elias lived. Rumors sharpened quickly, though none dared speak them too loudly. They said no outsider had set foot in Elias's line for decades. Sons born to brothers, nephews resembling fathers. It was all whispered as if naming it might summon something too grotesque to bear. The house itself carried an air of burden. Its beams groaned beneath years of storms, windows bowed inward as though even the structure strained beneath the secrets of men who never looked beyond their blood. The boy's earliest days unfolded under strict watch. He never left the homestead alone. An uncle carried him through fields, a father paced beside, while other brothers watched like sentinels, ensuring no wandering eyes drew near. Even then, something about his face unsettled men who visited. His skin carried a pallor that seemed almost translucent, veins visible beneath. His gaze lingered longer than most infants, as if studying those around him. As months passed, neighbors noticed the boy's features aligning too perfectly. His jawline reflected Elias's brother's, his brow matched an older son. It was as though each man in the house lived again within him. Whispers carried through the valley. Men who worked the iron triangle at the mill spoke in hushed tones, suggesting the boy was not a child of chance, but the outcome of blood looping back upon itself. When Elias walked through town, others offered nods without meeting his eyes. None challenged him. His stature remained commanding, and though age had bent his shoulders, his authority silenced questions before they could be formed. The boy's name, Vernon, was spoken sparingly. To say it aloud felt dangerous, as though naming him acknowledged the truth that everyone already feared. He was both son and reminder, bound by secrecy. Within the house, Vernon was treated differently. Other sons were sent to trade with workers, to chop wood, to hunt across ridges. But Vernon remained inside, surrounded always by fathers and uncles guarding him closely. At night he lay awake, hearing the murmurs of men beyond wooden walls. Their voices dropped to whispers whenever his name arose. The boy sensed early that his life was not like theirs. As he grew, Elias instructed his brothers never to let Vernon wander into town without company. Men were watchful, but watchfulness masked fear. They knew neighbors suspected, and suspicion could destroy everything built on silence. Still, Vernon could not be hidden forever. By his 10th year, he walked with long strides, pale skin gleaming against the valley dusk. Hunters crossing ridges reported seeing him watching from trees, unmoving, unnervingly still. Those hunters said he carried objects in his hands, sometimes rope, sometimes a carved stick sharpened to a point. Always silent, always observing, he gave the impression of someone older than his years. Back at the mill, workers exchanged stories. They claimed Elias's house echoed with strange sounds at night, low chants, rhythmic stomping, and sudden silence. No one dared approach too closely, fearing what they might find inside. The boy's presence only deepened unease. He was neither welcomed nor rejected by other men, but tolerated, as one tolerates a storm that cannot be stopped, yet might destroy everything if challenged. By adolescence, Vernon's features had sharpened. His cheekbones matched one brother, his nose mirrored an uncle, his eyes reflected Elias himself. Looking at him was like staring into a distorted mirror of every man surrounding him. No teacher guided Vernon, no outsider instructed him. Instead, older brothers and uncles drilled him with scripture, old tales, and superstitions. His knowledge was fragmented, drawn entirely from men who carried the same blood. He became quiet, moving like a shadow. His words were few, his silences long. Men who spoke with him said his gaze carried weight, as though he knew truths they feared to utter themselves. When neighbors saw Vernon working the fields, they kept distance. Something about his movements unsettled them. Methodical, precise, almost unnatural. He swung tools with strength, yet without rhythm, as if obeying unseen instructions. Elias grew older, his face weathered like bark. Yet his control over the household remained firm. He decided when Vernon would appear outside, when he would stay hidden, and how he would be spoken of. Men across the valley questioned privately how long secrecy could last. But no one dared confront Elias. He had influence, strength, and the loyalty of his sons and brothers, all bound by blood and fear. The boy's adolescence deepened his strangeness. He did not laugh with others, did not join games of wrestling or sport. Instead, he lingered on porches, staring into distance, silent as the hills themselves. By 16, Vernon's appearance turned unsettling. Not disfigured, not monstrous, simply too symmetrical, too precise. His features matched the men of his house so closely that others could not distinguish father from son, brother from brother. Neighbors whispered that Elias had gone too far, allowing the bloodline to fold inward until it consumed itself. Yet still, none dared to intervene. Fear of the patriarch outweighed even the dread of truth. One night, after too much cider, a worker from the mill claimed Vernon had spoken to him. The boy admitted openly he had never known any man beyond those within his own household. The worker left the valley the next morning, abandoning wages, tools, and obligations. His departure was never questioned, for men understood. Once Vernon's truth touched you, it clung like shadow, impossible to shake. Elias, though aging, seemed unmoved by these events. He tightened his grip on Vernon, keeping him closer, ensuring no more secrets leaked. Silence grew thicker, spreading through the house like smoke without flame. Inside the homestead, arguments sometimes erupted. Deep voices clashed in the night, followed by long silences. Neighbors heard, but did not investigate. They knew no good came from crossing Elias or his sons, and so Vernon's hidden birth remained concealed within walls of timber and stone, guarded by men who chose silence over confession and a valley too fearful to confront what lived in plain sight. The boy was no ordinary child. He was a living embodiment of secrecy, the result of bloodlines turned inward, a son who bore the burden of men unwilling to face the consequences of their choices. The valley would never forget his presence. Even when silence swallowed words, his figure lingered in memory. The boy named Vernon was not only born of men, he was bound entirely by them. The homestead stood like a fortress, its walls darkened by years of smoke and storms. Inside, men moved in silence, their routines rehearsed through generations, their loyalties shaped not by choice, but by blood. Every morning, the iron triangle at the mill rang out. Men filed from their porches with axes, shovels, and saws. Their work was grueling, yet nothing compared to the burden of their secrets. Elias, still patriarch, demanded obedience. His sons and brothers answered him without hesitation. Their loyalty was not spoken but understood, bound by unbreakable cords of silence, each man protecting the truth by burying it deeper. In the evenings, they gathered on sagging porches, rough hands rolled tobacco and voices hummed low. Conversation circled endlessly around crops, timber, and weather. Never once did anyone speak Vernon's name beyond those walls. Inside, Vernon grew under constant watch. Fathers and uncles tracked his every step, teaching him scripture, work, and obedience. No outsiders entered his world. His entire life belonged to men who carried the same blood. When disputes arose among them, voices thundered, brothers clashed in words, sometimes fists. Yet once the storm ended, silence reclaimed the house. Arguments never left the walls. Outsiders remained ignorant of what truly passed inside. Elias's authority stretched like iron across them all. His word alone determined when Vernon appeared beyond the homestead. He controlled not only the boy's movements, but also the mouths of every man tied to him. The silence they kept was suffocating. Workers at the mill sensed it. Neighbors felt it. No one asked questions directly, but every man knew that behind Elias's door lay a truth too dangerous to speak. When strangers occasionally passed through the valley, they noticed the absence of wives, sisters, or daughters. The settlement was shaped entirely by men, their households constructed of uncles, sons, and brothers bound in one circle. The outsiders left quickly. They saw only watchful eyes, heard only muted words. They felt the weight of secrecy pressing against them, and none dared to linger where silence was heavier than stone. Within the homestead, Vernon learned obedience not as lesson, but as law. He spoke rarely, listened always, and understood early that words were weapons. Silence was the only shield strong enough to keep him safe. At night, he listened to whispers from adjoining rooms. Fathers spoke with brothers, uncles warned sons. They never said everything aloud, as though half-truths were safer than complete confessions. Vernon absorbed it all without question. In the fields, he worked alongside men whose faces mirrored his own, their features blurred together, jawlines alike, eyes repeating, hands identical in their strength. To strangers, it was unsettling. To Vernon, it was all he knew. Sometimes neighbors spotted Vernon walking alone along the ridges. His steps were steady, his eyes distant. When asked about him, Elias's brothers deflected with grunts and silence. They protected the boy with denial as much as watchfulness. Even among themselves, they rarely used his name. Calling him the boy was safer, less direct. It reduced the risk of betraying the secret to an outsider's ear. Silence even invaded their most ordinary moments. The secrecy bound them tighter than chains. Each man knew the truth, yet none could voice it. To admit it openly would destroy them all, so silence became survival, and survival became ritual. Vernon's growth magnified their burden. As he became taller, stronger, and older, his resemblance to his fathers and uncles deepened, Every glance at him reminded them of what they had done and what they concealed. Still, Elias forbade anyone from treating him differently. "He is ours," the patriarch declared. And so, despite unease, the men obeyed, continuing to raise Vernon as both son and symbol of their silent pact. Some nights, men from neighboring homesteads claimed they saw lantern light flickering long past midnight within Elias's house. Shadows moved across windows, accompanied by low chanting, but no man dared investigate what rituals bound them together. The silence extended beyond Vernon. No man spoke of Elias's dead brothers, nor of those who had disappeared into ridges. Whispers suggested they too had been silenced, buried beneath the weight of secrets unshared. Every bond inside that house carried tension. Fathers trusted sons, but not fully. Brothers depended on brothers, but suspicion lingered. The silence that held them together also threatened to pull them apart with every passing year. At times, Vernon overheard his name carried by the wind. At the mill, workers muttered. At the river, men cursed. Yet whenever he turned, faces hardened, and words dissolved into silence before reaching him. The boy's very existence altered how men spoke. They censored themselves unconsciously, weighing each phrase against risk. Silence became habit, shaping even their thoughts. Vernon was raised in a world where truth was never fully spoken. Elias ensured the silence never cracked. He punished loose tongues with harsh labor or exile from the house. Any man who spoke Vernon's name too freely found himself working ridges alone for weeks. By enforcing silence, Elias preserved control, but beneath the order lay rot. Each man carried questions, doubts, fears. They swallowed them daily, hoping silence would keep everything contained. Yet secrecy fermented, waiting for a chance to burst. Vernon sensed this heaviness. Though no one explained, he felt it in glances exchanged, in pauses too long, in conversations that ended when he entered a room. Silence became the language he spoke most fluently. Despite everything, he grew strong. Work hardened his muscles, isolation sharpened his instincts. He became a figure of endurance, silent, observant, unsettling. The silence had not broken him. It had shaped him into something else entirely. By his 18th year, Vernon walked among neighbors with a presence impossible to ignore. His silence unnerved them more than words could. They saw in him the embodiment of Elias's household, secretive, controlled, and unyielding. At gatherings of men, his stillness stood out. Others laughed, argued, or drank loudly. Vernon simply watched, his pale eyes steady. His silence weighed heavier than their words, and few dared meet his gaze directly. Some claimed silence was contagious. Those who spent too long near Vernon began to speak less, hesitate more, glance over shoulders. His presence carried an invisible pressure, pulling men into the same secrecy that defined him. Even Elias, once unshakable, grew wary of Vernon's silence. The boy was no longer boy. He was man now, and silence wielded by man carried power capable of challenging even the patriarch himself. Brothers debated quietly when Elias slept. Could silence hold forever? Could Vernon be contained within the boundaries set by tradition? The questions remained unspoken aloud, yet each man felt them gnawing beneath the surface. The homestead creaked under the strain. Walls whispered at night with shifting timbers, as though even the house itself struggled to contain secrets. Vernon walked its halls like a ghost, embodying every unspoken truth. Neighbors avoided Elias's land. Paths curved wide. Hunters steered clear. Workers refused to pass near fences. Silence stretched beyond walls, shaping the valley itself. The boy's existence transformed everything into a landscape of fear. Vernon bore it quietly. He never questioned his place, never asked about whispers. Silence was all he knew, all he trusted. The pact of fathers, uncles, and brothers was etched into his very being. The brotherhood of silence endured, yet with every year, it tightened around them. What began as protection became prison, and Vernon, born of secrecy, was both its prisoner and its ultimate reminder. By the time Elias grew frail, silence had consumed them all. Words no longer bridged distances between men. Only glances, nods, and unfinished thoughts remained. Vernon carried their legacy forward, bound entirely by silence. The boy named Vernon entered childhood under a sky that seemed always heavy. Shadows clung to the ridges, and silence filled the valley, as though even the land itself shared the weight of secrets. Inside the homestead, his days were shaped by men who never left his side. Fathers, uncles, and brothers hovered constantly, ensuring that Vernon's world remained enclosed within timber walls and guarded thresholds. His earliest lessons came not from outsiders, but from men of his own blood. They taught him scripture, field work, and silence. He learned early that questions could be dangerous, and answers might bring ruin. Other boys in the valley roamed freely, laughing along riverbanks, wrestling in fields, exploring ridges. Vernon observed them from a distance, never joining. His steps were guided back home by watchful brothers and stern fathers. When he attempted to wander, an uncle's hand grasped his shoulder, pulling him back. The warning was unspoken, but its meaning was clear. His place was within the walls, not among strangers. By the age of 10, Vernon's presence unsettled those who glimpsed him. His features bore uncanny resemblance to every man of the homestead, as if he were the living sum of their shared lineage. Neighbors whispered in muted voices, claiming the boy looked older than his years. His pale eyes held a stillness unnatural for a child. He watched with intensity, as though he understood things never spoken aloud. His speech was sparse, his tone low. He often answered questions with silence, or with short phrases stripped of detail. Men who spoke to him left unsettled, unsure if he truly understood or simply refused. At night, Vernon listened to murmured arguments between brothers and uncles. Their voices clashed, then fell quiet. Silence followed, thicker than smoke. The boy absorbed their tension, feeling it settle inside him like stone. Discipline was strict. A missed chore earned long hours in fields, carrying water or stacking timber. He accepted punishments without protest, his silence unnerving even the sternest fathers. Obedience was demanded, and he gave it. Still, Vernon's difference could not be hidden. His gait was deliberate, his expression rarely shifting. Other boys smiled or shouted during work. Vernon remained expressionless, as if carved from the same oak as the homestead. Some claimed he spoke to himself in fields, whispering phrases only he could hear. Hunters swore they saw him standing motionless among trees, eyes locked on them, waiting until they turned away uneasily. Elias, though old, continued watching Vernon carefully. His gaze lingered longer than others, as if measuring how much of himself and how much of his brothers had fused within the boy's growing frame. The boy was never sent to school. Instead, older sons drilled him in numbers, scripture, and fragments of history. His education was narrow, confined to the knowledge of men who shared his blood. Despite isolation, Vernon's strength grew. By adolescence, his shoulders broadened from labor. His hands became calloused, his back strong. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man twice his age, never wasting effort. Still, he remained apart from others. Neighbors' sons mocked him in whispers, though never to his face. They feared his stare, the pale eyes that seemed to strip away pretense and reveal hidden thoughts. When gatherings of men occurred, Vernon stood silently at the edge. While others laughed or shared drink, he lingered like an omen. His silence weighed on them more than drunken words or careless jokes. Some workers claimed his presence silenced conversations. They found themselves speaking less, pausing more, as though his gaze compelled them toward the same secrecy that shaped his household. Vernon's quiet influence extended beyond walls. Within the homestead, Vernon rarely spoke his desires. He ate what was given, wore what was handed, worked where commanded. His obedience unsettled even the patriarch, for it lacked resentment. It was pure silence. By his 15th year, Vernon's face seemed a portrait painted from every man around him. His jaw resembled an uncle, his brow a brother, his eyes Elias himself. He embodied their entire bloodline in flesh. This resemblance disturbed neighbors. They whispered that no outsider's blood had entered Elias's household for generations. Every glance at Vernon confirmed their suspicion. He was the product of lineage turned inward, a mirror of corruption. Yet Vernon carried himself with composure. He did not deny who he was, nor attempt to hide his resemblance. He walked openly, his silence proclaiming what words never could. He was entirely theirs. The homestead creaked with age, its timbers heavy with secrets. Vernon moved through halls like a shadow, each step quiet, deliberate. He seemed less boy and more apparition, haunting the same walls that concealed him. When storms rolled through the valley, other boys huddled together in fear. Vernon sat alone by windows, staring into thunder without blinking. His calm unsettled those who saw it, as though he welcomed darkness. The valley began avoiding Elias's land altogether. Paths curved wider, fences marked invisible boundaries no one dared cross. Vernon's presence transformed the homestead into forbidden ground, a place spoken of only in whispers. Still, Elias demanded loyalty from his sons and brothers. Their silence continued, their obedience unwavering. Vernon was not hidden, but neither was he explained. His existence was both accepted and denied, never fully acknowledged. By 17, he worked harder than most grown men. His strength matched his silence. He labored from dawn until dusk without complaint, carrying burdens that broke others. His endurance seemed unnatural, fueled by something unseen. Neighbors spoke of him less but thought of him more. His presence was unavoidable, his silence unforgettable. Even men who never saw him directly claimed they dreamed of pale eyes watching from ridges. Inside, Vernon remained unchanged. He ate with others, worked with others, yet was never truly among them. He existed like a shadow cast upon the household, inseparable yet different, a constant reminder of secrecy. Elias aged further, his control tightening as his strength waned. He leaned on silence more than ever, using it as weapon and shield. Vernon mirrored him, carrying silence as inheritance, his only true legacy. Arguments flared among brothers about Vernon's future. Some feared his presence, others defended him. But none broke silence publicly. They remained bound, prisoners of the pact forged generations before. Silence ruled stronger than voices. Vernon himself never questioned. His obedience was total, his silence absolute. He had been shaped by shadows, molded by secrecy, and grown into a man whose presence carried the weight of an entire lineage. By the close of his youth, Vernon stood as both son and symbol. His childhood had been swallowed by shadows, his voice consumed by silence. He was no longer boy. He was legacy incarnate. The valley knew it too. Though no man spoke his name openly, every whisper, every glance carried its weight. Vernon's childhood in shadows had ended, but the silence surrounding him had only grown darker. Vernon emerged into manhood under skies that seemed to darken when he walked. His silence grew heavier, his stature broader, and his presence unsettled every man who crossed paths with him. He no longer resembled merely one relative. Instead, his features blended every father, uncle, and brother into a single face. Looking upon him was like staring into an ancestral mirror twisted by time. Neighbors avoided eye contact. At the mill, men turned away when Vernon appeared. Conversations faltered, laughter died. His stillness demanded respect, but it was respect rooted in unease rather than admiration. He carried himself with deliberate calm. His movements were slow, precise, and steady. When he entered a room, silence deepened. Men shifted uncomfortably, sensing something unnatural within the simplicity of his presence. Elias, though frail, still commanded obedience. Yet even he seemed wary of Vernon's growing dominance. The boy who once followed was now a man whose silence weighed heavier than the patriarch's spoken authority. Workers at the mill spoke cautiously. Some claimed Vernon followed them with his eyes, never blinking, watching until they finished their work. They felt exposed, as if every secret they carried was already known. No man confronted him. Fear outweighed curiosity. Vernon spoke little, and when he did, his words were stripped bare, direct, unsettling. He revealed nothing, yet his silences suggested he knew more than anyone wished. By his 20th year, Vernon worked harder than most. He carried timber that broke younger men, dug trenches through frozen earth, and lifted weights alone that others could not move together. His strength became legend, yet strength only deepened unease. Men respected power earned through toil, but Vernon's endurance seemed beyond natural limits. His silence made it worse. He bore burdens without complaint, as though suffering was his natural state. Gatherings of men became uneasy when Vernon arrived. He drank little, laughed never, and spoke less. Yet his presence dominated every space. Men found themselves adjusting behavior, avoiding conflict, silencing jokes in his company. Elias recognized this shift. The patriarch, who once ruled with authority, now watched as Vernon quietly took command. Without asking, without demanding, Vernon's silence bent others. It was power earned, without a single challenge. Neighbors spoke of him in shadows. They feared what he represented. Generations of secrecy embodied in one man. He was not just Elias's son. He was every forbidden bond carried forward into flesh. At night, lights flickered from the homestead. Men passing claimed to hear chants, stomps, and silences more chilling than sound. They said Vernon led these gatherings, his deep voice weaving through rhythms older than memory. The valley avoided Elias's land altogether. Paths curved wider, fences stretched further. Vernon's presence transformed acres into forbidden ground, a place men spoke of cautiously, as though uttering his name might summon him silently nearby. Inside, Vernon embraced the silence as destiny. He never sought escape, never asked questions. He belonged entirely to the pact of fathers, brothers, and uncles. His existence was proof, his silence testimony none could ignore. Workers began leaving the valley. Some refused to explain why. They abandoned tools, left cabins empty. Their silence became explanation enough. Men claimed Vernon's gaze haunted them long after they had departed his land. Those who remained tightened their own silences. Conversations grew shorter, gatherings quieter. The presence of one man reshaped the entire settlement into reflection of himself, cautious, fearful, bound by words never spoken aloud. By his 25th year, Vernon was no longer considered merely strange. He was feared. Men avoided his shadow, yet could not deny his authority. He became both symbol and sovereign of a silence none could break. Elias, weakened by age, ceded control. It was not announced, not discussed. Vernon simply assumed it, his silence pressing harder than any command. Fathers and uncles obeyed him as they once obeyed Elias. The valley itself seemed transformed. Rivers ran quieter, forests felt heavier. Hunters claimed even animals stilled when Vernon walked among them, as though silence reached beyond men into nature itself. He became force, not figure. Neighbors whispered that Vernon was cursed. Others insisted he was chosen, but none dared voice such claims directly. Fear bound them tighter than belief. To them, Vernon was no longer man. He was warning. When storms raged across ridges, Vernon stood outside, unflinching. Lightning illuminated his pale figure against darkened skies. Men watching from cabins spoke of him as if witnessing omen rather than neighbor. His silence rivaled thunder. At gatherings, his silence often concluded disputes. Men arguing fell quiet when Vernon entered. No words required. His presence sufficed. He had become arbiter of silence, judge of disputes without ever declaring judgment. Elias's decline deepened, yet Vernon's rise was undeniable. The household no longer whispered about him. They obeyed him. Uncles deferred, brothers yielded, fathers followed. Silence had reshaped hierarchy, placing Vernon at its absolute center. Yet the valley's fear never eased. They avoided paths near his land, refused to trade directly, and carried his name only in hushed tones. Vernon's legend grew larger than his presence, heavier than truth. Some nights, neighbors swore they saw him walking tree lines with lantern unlit, carrying nothing but rope. His figure, pale against shadows, haunted their dreams, leaving them to wake in sweat without explanation. Workers said the mill felt emptier without him, though he had never labored there. His absence was presence enough. Silence he carried seeped into spaces he never touched, infecting every corner of the valley. By 30, Vernon's power surpassed even memory of Elias. He was the valley's shadow, its secret incarnate. Men lived around him, beneath him, and under the silence he imposed without ever speaking command. The valley feared him, yet could not reject him. He was their blood, their neighbor, their reminder. Every man knew Vernon represented the cost of silence, the consequence of choosing secrecy over confession. His gaze carried history none wanted spoken. His silence reflected choices none could undo. To fear Vernon was to fear themselves, for he was not separate. He was them, magnified, twisted, and revealed. By middle age, Vernon had become untouchable. He required no defense, no explanation. Men avoided his eyes, obeyed his unspoken authority, and lived within the silence his presence demanded. The valley belonged to him entirely. Elias died quietly, buried by sons and brothers in stony ground. No service, no ceremony, only silence. Vernon stood over the grave longer than others, his expression unreadable, his silence sealing the patriarch's legacy. From that day, no one questioned Vernon's rule. He had inherited not merely land, but silence itself. His presence carried weight heavier than laws, stronger than weapons, unbreakable as blood. The valley belonged to him. Neighbors accepted his dominance in silence, for resistance would require speech, and silence had already conquered them. Vernon was not feared for violence, but for the truth he represented, a truth none could face aloud. The valley lived in shadow, bound by silence, ruled by a man who spoke little yet commanded all. Vernon was no longer anomaly. He was sovereign, a figure etched into fear and secrecy. Every ridge, every path, every whisper belonged to him. The valley had no voice left. Silence was absolute, and at its core stood Vernon, the man the valley feared, and the silence it could never escape. In the valley, silence shielded Vernon's existence, but beyond the ridges, scholars and thinkers spoke of bloodlines. They studied what men like Elias had created, warning of consequences carried in the very marrow of sons. Blood is more than heritage. It carries instructions for bodies to build themselves. When men fold lineage inward, generation upon generation, those instructions lose clarity. Errors multiply, and the body becomes a vessel for shadows. Scientists examined cases across the world, isolated villages, mountain settlements, hidden households of men bound by tradition. The patterns repeated, sons resembling uncles too closely, nephews carrying the same flaws, brothers mirroring each other unnaturally. When lineages collapsed inward, sons suffered. Jaws malformed, limbs weakened, eyes dulled, and minds clouded. Each trait was not punishment from outside, but the inevitable result of instructions broken by repetition within blood. Vernon embodied these truths. His face echoed his father's and uncle's so precisely it unsettled neighbors. He was living evidence of what science called genetic collapse, the narrowing of possibility until only reflection remained. Scholars explained that variety strengthens blood. When strangers meet, their sons inherit differences that protect them. But in households like Elias's, where brothers bred within closed circles, difference disappeared, leaving only fragility behind. The valley saw this in Vernon's pale skin, in his unnatural silence, in his endurance that seemed both strength and curse. He was stronger than most, yet carried strangeness that set him apart irreversibly. Other valleys had seen similar sons, men born from brothers and uncles, raised without outsiders. Their lives were shorter, their bodies frailer, their minds filled with shadows. Science called it inbreeding. The valley called it shame. But shame did not erase consequences. Sons bore the weight of choices fathers made. Vernon carried centuries of decisions, each one narrowing the path until his existence became inevitable. He was the conclusion of silence. Researchers described it simply. Closed bloodlines produce weakness. Muscles might grow, but organs falter. Minds might endure, but clarity dims. Generations pay the price when diversity is denied. Vernon was a case study in flesh. Men feared this truth because it mirrored them. To condemn Vernon was to condemn themselves, for their blood shaped him. Silence had not only hidden him, it had created him, one generation at a time. The science of bloodlines explained more than biology. It revealed psychology, too. Sons born into secrecy absorbed silence, inheriting not only traits of body, but patterns of mind. Vernon's quiet obedience was legacy as much as genetics. Fathers passed down silence like heirloom. Uncles taught avoidance like scripture. Brothers enforced obedience with fists and glares. These behaviors compounded across generations until Vernon became both product of genes and mirror of culture. Studies showed that such households often fractured. Without outsiders to balance, men turned inward, repeating mistakes, amplifying flaws. Silence became not shield, but prison. Vernon's homestead embodied this truth, every creaking board groaning with it. The valley could not ignore evidence, though none dared name it. They saw his resemblance, his strangeness, his silence. Each detail aligned with science they never studied but instinctively feared, bloodlines collapsing inward upon themselves. Other men feared Vernon not simply because he was strange, but because he revealed their vulnerability. He showed what happens when men refuse change, when they cling too tightly to blood, refusing fresh roots. Science warned of defects, but defects were more than visible. Minds, too, could twist. Isolation bred suspicion, silence bred paranoia, repetition bred obsession. Vernon's stillness, his lack of words, reflected psychological collapse as well. Scholars in distant cities wrote of royal houses collapsing from within, empires weakened by lineage folded too tightly. Yet in Vernon's valley, the same principles played out quietly, hidden behind ridges and silence. Each generation had choices. Fathers could have broken tradition, sought strength through strangers, widened bloodlines. But silence forbade it. Loyalty chained them. And so Vernon was born not by accident, but by inevitability. The science of bloodlines was merciless. It explained without judgment, but its clarity was terrifying. Sons carried the burden of fathers' choices. Vernon bore it with every step, every glance, every unsettling moment of stillness. Some argued that endurance could emerge, that narrowing bloodlines sometimes concentrated strength. Vernon's body seemed to prove it. His silence carried power. His strength surpassed others. Yet even this strength was twisted, feared, and unnatural. In laboratories, men examined charts and samples. In the valley, they needed only to look at Vernon. He was both anomaly and evidence, embodying every warning science had uttered, standing as silent proof. The settlement understood instinctively what scholars wrote formally. Closed bloodlines lead to collapse. It was not curse nor myth. It was consequence. Vernon was its face, its body, its echo across every whispered conversation. Men who left the valley escaped more than Vernon. They escaped what he represented. To live under his gaze was to live under evidence that their silence had bred something undeniable, something neither natural nor chosen. The science of bloodlines illuminated their fears but offered no comfort. Undoing generations was impossible. Once lineage closed upon itself, the result was sealed. Vernon was sealed. His silence was permanent, his existence irreversible. Other men in the valley carried fragments of the same inheritance. They walked differently, spoke oddly, resembled one another too closely. Vernon was extreme, but not alone. He was simply the most visible consequence. Science offered statistics, but statistics meant little compared to presence. Vernon's presence silenced rooms, unsettled workers, and reshaped the valley's behavior. He was more convincing than charts or books. He was living truth none could deny. By middle age, Vernon's legend spread beyond ridges. Travelers carried stories of pale men, of silence heavier than words, of households where sons mirrored uncles too closely. These tales were dismissed as folklore elsewhere. Yet in the valley, men knew better. Folklore required invention. Vernon required none. His silence, his resemblance, his endurance, everything aligned with what science warned but outsiders ignored. He was truth dressed as myth. The study of bloodlines revealed one more truth. Secrecy never holds forever. Defects expose themselves, silence cracks, consequences manifest. Elias's household learned this too late. Vernon's birth was not accident. It was revelation. The valley lived with this revelation daily. Every glance at Vernon confirmed it. His silence was science made flesh. His presence a study without paper. His existence a warning carved into bone and shadow. Scholars might have written about him, but the valley lived beneath him. Vernon was both subject and scientist, both product and proof. His silence explained everything, even when no words were spoken, turned inward. When Vernon reached the height of his years, silence no longer surrounded only his homestead. It stretched across the entire valley, pressing into ridges, rivers, and every man who remained within its grasp. He was no longer simply a figure of fear. He had become myth carried in flesh. To speak his name aloud felt dangerous, as though it might draw his pale eyes into the conversation. Generations passed beneath his shadow. Sons grew into men who whispered of him. Fathers aged while avoiding his gaze. Uncles shifted uneasily when his presence lingered too long. Silence itself seemed inherited like blood. The valley changed slowly. Cabins rotted, fields lay fallow, mills closed, men abandoned their homes. Yet Vernon remained, walking ridges with bare feet, carrying silence heavier than words, haunting land that once bustled with work. Those who left carried stories. They spoke in distant taverns of a pale man who ruled without voice, of uncles and brothers bound by secrecy, of a lineage folded so tightly it crushed itself. Outsiders dismissed these tales as superstition. They claimed no man could silence an entire valley. But those who had lived beneath Vernon's gaze knew truth. Silence can conquer more effectively than violence. Over time, the homestead itself collapsed. Roof beams sagged, walls caved, floorboards surrendered to rot. Yet men swore Vernon still walked among ruins, unbothered by decay, carrying silence like a crown that never tarnished. Travelers crossing ridges sometimes reported sightings. A lone man, pale against twilight, standing still among trees. He did not approach, did not speak. He only watched, reminding them they were trespassing on silence. The valley grew infamous among wanderers. Compasses spun near its center, hunters refused to linger, workers avoided trails leading inward. Vernon's legacy stretched beyond men. Nature itself seemed altered by his unyielding presence. Those who dared camp nearby reported dreams. They woke drenched in sweat, claiming Vernon's eyes stared from darkness, unblinking. His silence followed them into daylight, lingering long after they left the valley behind. Men argued whether Vernon still lived or had become spirit. Some swore they touched his hand in passing. Others claimed he vanished before their eyes. Whatever he was, his silence endured undeniably. Legacy is not always spoken. Sometimes it lingers like shadow. Vernon's silence was inheritance none escaped. Every man who knew him carried fragments, even those who fled valleys, ridges, and memories of his gaze. Sons raised in distant places carried unease in their blood. They avoided mirrors, distrusted silence, and feared shadows at night. Though far from Vernon, they remained tied to him by inheritance written deep within marrow. Historians later examined the valley's decline. They found records of cabins abandoned, mills shuttered, fields untended. Yet the real cause lay not in soil or timber. It lay in silence embodied by Vernon himself. They wrote of lineage turned inward, of men who chose secrecy over survival. Vernon became symbol in their studies, a warning of what happens when bloodlines fold too tightly and words vanish altogether. The story spread as cautionary tale. Fathers warned sons never to repeat mistakes of Elias's house. Brothers told brothers to seek beyond ridges. Silence was no longer shield, it was curse etched into memory. Yet some resisted the lesson. They argued Vernon's strength proved silence held power. His endurance surpassed others, his presence dominated. They admired him, forgetting fear. In admiring, they revealed how easily legacy twists perception. But legacy is not truth. It is shadow. Vernon's silence haunted men not because it empowered, but because it devoured. His life was testament to what secrecy breeds when carried through generations unchecked. The valley never recovered. Even when new settlers arrived decades later, they felt unease. Compasses spun, trees bent oddly, winds carried whispers. They claimed land itself remembered Vernon, echoing silence no man could erase. Ruins of the homestead remained scattered across moss and vine. Travelers described feeling watched, though no figure appeared. Some swore footprints marked soil, bare and fresh, as though Vernon still wandered silently among them. Stories persisted. Around fires, men retold them, of uncles and fathers bound in secrecy, of a son who carried silence heavier than steel, of a valley conquered without battle. Vernon became legend, though born in truth. Each telling reinforced lesson. Silence may preserve, but it also destroys. What Elias believed would protect his household eventually consumed it. Vernon was proof, his existence the unavoidable conclusion of generations refusing to break. Men feared repeating such mistakes. They sought outsiders, welcomed strangers, and widened bloodlines. Yet deep in their minds, fear lingered that silence might return, carried once again by some descendant they had overlooked. Science, history, and folklore converged on Vernon's story. Scholars wrote, locals whispered, wanderers feared. Yet none denied his legacy. He was not invention nor fiction. He was silence born of men, living consequence. The homestead's fall did not erase him. If anything, ruin preserved his presence. Where walls once confined him, land itself became his domain. The valley was no longer settlement. It was monument to secrecy. Even now, hikers claim to see him, pale, ageless, barefoot, standing at tree lines. He never speaks, never approaches. He only watches, carrying silence as if it were crown, inheritance, and curse combined. Vernon's story endures because silence endures. Words fade, papers burn. but silence lingers. His legacy is not carved in stone nor inked in books. It is carved in unease felt by every man who remembers. The darkness he left was not absence of light, but absence of speech. Without words, men could not confront, confess, or heal. Vernon embodied that absence, ensuring silence outlived every voice in the valley. Generations later, his figure still unsettles, not simply for what he was, but for what he represented. He was the cost of secrecy, the embodiment of silence, the warning etched into history's darkest corners. Vernon remains both legend and lesson. His silence speaks across time, cautioning men of what unfolds when brotherhood turns inward and words are buried. His legacy is not forgotten. It is whispered, heavy as ever. And so, the valley endures as monument. Trees grow taller, rivers carve deeper, but silence remains. At its center stands Vernon, not in flesh perhaps, but in memory, myth, and warning. His legacy is eternal.